The first thing Special Agent Dana Whitfield noticed was the smell. Not drugs, not chemicals, frozen walleye. Thousands of pounds of it, stacked in white cardboard cartons on pallets stretching the length of a refrigerated warehouse on the industrial fringe of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. The second thing she noticed was that the fish had been dead far too long to be worth selling to anyone. And yet the paperwork showed these shipments had been invoiced, received, and paid for, every single one, at premium market rate. It was January, 17 degrees below zero outside, and the warehouse hummed with the low drone of industrial cooling units that didn't need to run at all. The cold was already here. Minnesota had plenty of it, and the Sinaloa cartel, as it turned out, had found a way to turn that cold into $250 million. This is the story of how a routine freight audit by a single ICE analyst in St. Paul uncovered one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations ever documented in the American Midwest, a scheme that converted fictitious shipments of frozen fish into clean cash, moved it through a network of shell companies spanning 3 countries, and funneled it directly back to cartel leadership operating out of Culiacan. It is also the story of the people who built the scheme, the federal agents who dismantled it, and the uncomfortable truth about how long it operated in plain sight before anyone thought to look. It started, as many investigations do, with a number that didn't make sense. In March of the previous year, an ICE Homeland Security Investigations analyst named Terrence Okafor was reviewing customs declarations tied to a broader probe into fraudulent import documentation at the port of Duluth. He was looking for discrepancies in grain shipments. Agricultural fraud was the actual assignment, when a line item snagged his attention. A company called Northern Meridian Logistics had declared the import of $400,000 worth of frozen freshwater fish from a processing facility in Mazatlan, Mexico. The shipment had cleared customs without incident, but Okafor, who had grown up fishing Lake Mille Lacs with his father, knew something the customs inspector apparently didn't. Walleye is not commercially harvested in Mazatlan. It's a freshwater species. Mazatlan is on the Pacific coast. The declaration was the biological equivalent of claiming to import Atlantic salmon from a lake in Nebraska. Okafor flagged the entry. Then he searched for other declarations from the same company. He found 67 more over the previous 18 months, totaling just under $12 million in declared value. Every one of them listed frozen freshwater fish shipped from coastal Mexican cities, where those species don't exist. Every one had cleared customs. Every one had been paid for by wire transfer from a U.S.-based account held by a company called Great Lakes Provisions, registered in Bloomington, Minnesota. Okafor brought his findings to his supervisor, who brought them to the FBI's Minneapolis field office. Within a week, what had started as a footnote in a grain fraud investigation became a joint federal task force with a classified operational name and a very short list of people authorized to know it existed. The FBI assigned the case to Dana Whitfield, a 15-year veteran of the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, who had spent the previous 3 years embedded in organized crime investigations along the southwest border. Whitfield was precise, methodical, and possessed a quality her colleagues described as aggressive patience, the ability to sit with incomplete information for months without rushing toward a conclusion. She would need every ounce of it. The first layer of the scheme was deceptively simple. Northern Meridian Logistics existed on paper, in corporation documents, a registered agent in Delaware, a functioning website with stock photos of shipping containers, but had no employees, no physical office, and no actual logistics capability. It was a billing entity, nothing more. Its sole function was to generate invoices for shipments that either didn't exist or contained worthless cargo, then submit those invoices to Great Lakes Provisions for payment. Great Lakes Provisions would pay the invoices via wire transfer to Northern Meridian's accounts, which were held at a regional bank in Minneapolis. From there, the money would be wired to corresponding accounts in Mexico and eventually to a series of accounts in the Cayman Islands that Whitfield's team would spend 4 months untangling. But the critical question, The one that determined whether this was a $12 million fraud or something vastly larger was where Great Lakes Provisions was getting its money. Because the wire transfers it sent to Northern Meridian were real. The funds existed. Someone was depositing enormous sums into the Great Lakes Provisions accounts, and that someone had to be identified. Whitfield's team obtained financial subpoenas and began tracing deposits into the Great Lakes accounts. What they found was a second shell company called Heartland Cold Storage Solutions, which operated out of a nondescript office park in Eagan. Heartland, in turn, received payments from a distributor called Twin Cities Fresh Market, which received payments from a cooperative called Prairie Select Foods, which received payments from a nonprofit called the Midwest Agricultural Workers Alliance. Each entity existed primarily on paper, each was registered to a different person, and each one added a layer of apparent legitimacy to cash that, at its origin, had no legitimate source at all. The money, Whitfield's team eventually determined, was being physically deposited in amounts carefully structured to stay below federal reporting thresholds at dozens of bank branches across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. Teams of couriers, most of them undocumented migrants who had been coerced or recruited by cartel associates, would walk into banks carrying between $8,000 and $9,000 in cash, deposited into one of the shell company accounts, and walk out. They did this day after day, branch after branch, city after city. The practice is called structuring, and it is federal crime. But it is also, when executed with discipline and geographic breadth, extraordinarily difficult to detect. The couriers never deposited enough to trigger a currency transaction report. They never used the same branch twice in a row, and they never spoke to anyone about what they were doing, because most of them had been told their families back in Sinaloa would be killed if they did. By the time Whitfield's team mapped the full network, they had identified over 200 individual couriers, 47 bank branches used for structured deposits, 6 shell companies forming the laundering chain, and a total volume of illicit cash flowing through the system that dwarfed the initial $12 million estimate. The revised figure, confirmed through forensic accounting conducted by the FBI's Financial Analysis Unit in coordination with the DEA's Special Operations Division, was $240 million laundered over a period of approximately 3 years. $240 million. Moved through a warehouse full of rotten fish in suburban Minneapolis. The man who built the machine was not a cartel soldier. He was not a gunman or a trafficker. He was an accountant. His name, or at least the name he used in Minnesota, was Arturo Beltran Solis, and he had arrived in the Twin Cities 6 years earlier on a student visa to pursue a master's degree in supply chain management at a university in St. Paul. He completed the degree. He filed his taxes. He drove a gray Honda Accord and lived in a rented townhouse in Maple Grove, where his neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man who worked in logistics. None of them knew that Beltran Solis had been recruited by Sinaloa cartel financial operatives while still in graduate school, identified as a high-value asset precisely because of his unremarkable profile and his expertise in the mundane machinery of American commerce. Beltran Solis didn't move drugs. He moved money, and he did it with a sophistication that reflected years of study, not of criminal methodology, but of the American financial system's blind spots. He understood that banks in the Midwest were understaffed for compliance. He understood that customs inspectors at secondary ports like Duluth processed thousands of declarations per week and rarely questioned commodity descriptions. He understood that the American appetite for shell companies, enabled by minimal state-level disclosure requirements, made it trivially easy to create corporate entities that looked real from the outside and were hollow within. He exploited not corruption, but complacency, and that made him far harder to catch. Whitfield spent months building a case against Beltran Solis without his knowledge. Surveillance teams tracked his movements. Wiretaps on his phone, authorized by federal judges in sealed proceedings, captured conversations in which he discussed shipment schedules and deposit rotations in coded language that the FBI's linguistic analysts gradually decoded. He referred to cash deposits as snowfall. He called the couriers farmers. He described successful laundering cycles as harvests. The agricultural metaphor was deliberate and consistent, designed to make intercepted communications sound like discussions about the legitimate food distribution business the shell companies pretended to be. But Beltran Solis made a mistake. It was not a dramatic error, no panicked phone call, no incriminating meeting in a parking garage. It was, like the man himself, mundane. In September, he used his personal email account, not the encrypted channels he typically employed, to send a spreadsheet to an associate in Culiacan. The spreadsheet contained routing numbers, deposit schedules, and projected laundering volumes for the next fiscal quarter. The FBI intercepted it, and the spreadsheet became the Rosetta Stone for the entire operation. With Beltran Solis's own documentation in hand, Whitfield's team could now correlate every structured deposit, every wire transfer, every fictitious invoice with specific dates, amounts, and participants. The case was no longer circumstantial. It was architectural. They had the blueprint, and they had the architect's signature on it. The raids were coordinated for a Tuesday morning in early November, chosen because Beltran Solis's own spreadsheet indicated that a major deposit cycle would be underway, meaning couriers would be active and traceable. At 5:45 in the morning, with the temperature at 9 degrees and the sky still black, simultaneous operations launched across 4 states. FBI and ICE agents hit the Brooklyn Park warehouse first. They breached the loading dock entrance and moved through rows of pallets stacked with worthless frozen fish, clearing the facility room by room. In the back office, behind a steel door secured with a commercial-grade electronic lock, they found what they had come for. Not drugs, but records. Filing cabinets containing years of fabricated invoices, hard drives, burner phones, a laptop running encrypted communication software that the FBI's cyber forensics team would spend weeks cracking, and in a floor safe bolted beneath the desk, $312,000 in cash, bundled and ready for deposit. Simultaneously, SWAT teams executed search warrants at the offices of every shell company in the laundering chain. DEA agents working in coordination with the task force arrested 11 couriers at bank branches in Minnesota and Wisconsin, catching them mid-deposit with structured cash. And at 6:12 in the morning, Dana Whitfield knocked on the door of a rented townhouse in Maple Grove and arrested Arturo Beltran Solis, who answered the door in a bathrobe and slippers, holding a cup of coffee. He said nothing. He asked for a lawyer. He had clearly prepared for this possibility, and his composure, Whitfield later said, was the most unnerving thing about him. In total, the operation resulted in 31 arrests across 4 states. Federal agents seized $4.7 million in cash, froze an additional $18 million in domestic bank accounts, and initiated international asset recovery proceedings targeting accounts in Mexico and the Cayman Islands. The Brooklyn Park warehouse was padlocked and placed under federal control. The fish, eventually, was destroyed. But the seizures, while significant, represented a fraction of the total laundered. $240 million had already been cleaned and moved. Much of it had reached cartel leadership in Sinaloa, funding operations that the DEA's intelligence analysts linked to fentanyl production at a drug superlab in rural Durango, a facility capable of producing millions of fentanyl pills per month, pills that were already flooding American cities and killing Americans at a rate that defied comprehension. The money Beltran Solis laundered through frozen fish invoices in Minnesota didn't stay abstract. It became precursor chemicals purchased in China. It became pill presses operating around the clock. It became body bags in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Massachusetts. There is something deeply disorienting about that connection. The idea that a warehouse full of rotten walleye in a Minneapolis suburb is linked by an unbroken chain of transactions to a fentanyl crisis killing tens of thousands of people a year. It challenges the way we think about cartel operations, which we tend to imagine as border phenomena, tunnels under the desert, drug tunnels packed with contraband, armed convoys in Sonoran Badlands. And those things exist, but the Sinaloa cartel, like any multinational enterprise, understood that logistics and finance are as critical as product. You can manufacture all the fentanyl in the world, but if you can't launder the proceeds, you can't sustain the operation. Beltran Solis was not a peripheral figure. He was infrastructure. He was the plumbing through which the money flowed, and without him, the machine would have seized. The investigation also exposed a harder truth about the human cost buried inside the financial architecture. The 200 couriers who had carried cash into banks across the Midwest were not willing participants in any meaningful sense. Most were undocumented migrants from rural Sinaloa and Durango who had been smuggled into the United States by cartel-affiliated human trafficking networks. They had been told they owed debts for their passage, debts that could only be repaid through service. They were housed in overcrowded apartments in Minneapolis and St. Paul, monitored by cartel associates, and given daily deposit assignments. Those who resisted or attempted to leave were threatened with violence against their families in Mexico. Several of the couriers, when interviewed by federal agents after their arrest, broke down and described conditions of captivity. They had been, in every functional sense, enslaved. 1CE's Homeland Security Investigations Division opened a parallel human trafficking case that remains ongoing. DHS officials involved in the investigation described the courier network as one of the most extensive migrant smuggling and labor exploitation operations ever documented in the Upper Midwest, a region not typically associated with cartel-driven trafficking. Arturo Beltran Solis was indicted on 37 federal counts, including money laundering conspiracy, structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements, operating an unlicensed money transmitting business, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. If convicted on all counts, he faces a statutory maximum sentence exceeding 100 years in federal prison. His trial has not yet occurred. He has not spoken publicly. Dana Whitfield returned to the FBI's Minneapolis field office and began work on the next case. There is always a next case. The networks adapt. The shell companies reconstitute under new names. The money finds new channels. But Whitfield, when asked by a colleague whether the Beltran Solis operation had been a success, gave an answer that stuck with everyone who heard it. "We caught the accountant," she said, "but the people who hired him are still in business." That's not a victory. That's a progress report. She was right. And that might be the most important thing to understand about investigations like this one. They don't end. They reveal. They peel back a layer and show you the machinery underneath. And the machinery is always bigger than you expected, always more embedded in ordinary life than you wanted to believe. A warehouse in Brooklyn Park. A spreadsheet sent from a Gmail account. A man in a bathrobe holding coffee. $240 million, laundered through fish that nobody ever intended to eat. Funding a drug empire that kills without ever touching a weapon. If this story made you think differently about how cartel money moves through American cities, share it, talk about it, because the next operation like this one is already running somewhere, inside a business that looks completely legitimate, in a town that would never suspect it. The cold doesn't just come from the Minnesota winter. It comes from how close all of this is and how invisible it stays until someone finally asks the right question. This has been a fictional dramatization. No real individuals were depicted. The story was inspired by documented patterns in federal money laundering investigations and is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only.